to It's a Complicated World After All. Today we're tackling the idea of network governance, a concept that promises inclusivity and collaboration in tackling global challenges. But as we'll discuss, it often comes with deeply entrenched power imbalances. So we'll dive into some examples from the UN, the WTO, and regional blocs like CARICOM. So, are small states being left behind, or is there room for meaningful change? I'm Gabrielle, and joining me today are Karen, our economist extraordinaire,
Thanks, Gabrielle. I'm ready to dive into how these systems function, especially the numbers and structures behind them.
and Danita, our fiery political analyst, who always keeps us grounded.
Gabrielle, these governance structures get me fired up because they really shape the way power is distributed globally. Let's get into it.
Great! So, networked governance. It's a concept we hear a lot about, but what does it actually mean? Karen, give us a starting point.
Sure. So, network governance is a system of decision making where multiple actors, that is, governments, international organizations, NGOs, and even corporations, they collaborate to address global challenges. So, it is designed to be flexible and decentralized. So, this makes sense for issues like climate change or pandemics that don't respect national borders.
So instead of one big power dictating terms, you have more players at the table. But Danita, does that really mean it's more inclusive?
That's where it gets tricky on paper, yes, but it's meant to be inclusive, but in practice, power imbalances still exist. For example, the United Nations, every country gets a vote in the General Assembly, but real decision-making power lies with the Security Council. And guess who dominates there? The five permanent members: the US, Russia, China, the UK, and France. Small states might get a voice, but it's not equal.
Right. So it sounds like the promise of inclusivity doesn't always translate into reality. But Karen, are there examples where governance has worked well for small states?
Well, they actually are. So CARICOM, the Caribbean community, is a great example of this. It allows small island states to band together and to negotiate as a bloc for global trade issues. This is collective bargaining and it gives them more weight than they have individually. But even CARICOM struggles to match the influence of larger players like the US or the EU.
That's interesting, especially when you think about how global crises like the pandemic have shown the need for more cooperation. But it sounds like even in these collaborative systems, smaller nations are at a disadvantage. So let's focus on two of the biggest players in global governance, the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Karen, walk us through what makes these institutions valuable for smaller states.
So, starting with the UN, one of its biggest strengths is that it provides a platform for small states to raise critical issues. For instance, small states like Tuvalu and Fiji have used the UN to spotlight the existential threat of climate change. The Paris Agreement, for example, was shaped in part by their advocacy.
And what about disaster relief? I imagine the UN also plays a major role there.
Well, absolutely. So after hurricanes or other natural disasters, the UN facilitates aid and recovery efforts. For small states that lack the resources to respond on their own, this support can be a lifeline.
Okay, so Danita, what's your take on the UN? Is it doing enough for these nations?
The UN has its merits, but let's not ignore its flaws. The power imbalance are glaring. For instance, while small states can get purpose resolutions, they often rely on support of larger powers to get anything passed. And then there is the World Trade Organization, which Karen can probably speak to, but trade policies often favor larger economies.
Karen, let's dig into that. The WTO sounds like it could help small states participate in global trade, but is it really a setup to support them?
Well, let's talk about it. So the WTO does lower barriers to trade, which is a win for small states, but it also acts as a mediator for disputes when arise, providing small state economies a platform to challenge unfair practices. However, the problem is bargaining power. Small states like Trinidad and Tobago have limited influence in negotiations. So larger economies would dictate the terms, reinforcing dependency.
And what about trade shocks? We've seen how vulnerable small economies can be to global market fluctuations.
Exactly. The global market is unpredictable, and when shocks occur, like the 2008 financial crisis, small states are hit the hardest. Their economies are already fragile, and recovery is slow compared to larger nations with more resources.
So while these institutions provide some benefits, the deck still seems stacked against smaller nations. So let's pivot to regional coalitions. Are these a better option for small states to amplify their voices, Danita?
They can be. Take CARICOM again. It allows Caribbean nations to negotiate as a bloc, which gives them more leverage in trade discussions. Another good example is OAIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. It is an issue-based coalition, coalition, that has been instrumental in climate diplomacy, pushing for global action on sea level rises and carbon emissions.
But even these coalitions have their limits. Look at the African Union. While it's been effective in addressing some regional issues, its member states often have competing interests. Wealthier nations like South Africa tend to dominate these discussions, leaving the smaller or poorer countries with less influence.
Okay, that's very fascinating. So, um, and what about the ASEAN in the Southeast Asia? It seems like they're fairly integrated.
ASEAN is a fascinating case. It is a strong regional bloc, but its policies of non-interference often makes it slow to respond to crises. For example, the coup in Maira exposed ASEAN's limitations. Member states couldn't agree on a unified response, which weakened their overall effectiveness.
So even with regional coalitions, power balances, and conflicting interests, it can undermine progress. So it's clear that small states need to be strategic about how they engage. So let's talk about some solutions. How do we make networked governance work better for small states?
So one idea that has been continually pushed forward, including by the BRICS, is the reformation of the United Nations Security Council to include permanent member seats for countries in Latin America or Africa. This would give underrepresented countries more influence in global decision making.
That's been a long-standing demand, hasn't it?
Mhm.
But progress has been very slow.
Yes, Gabrielle, very slow. Another solution is greater South-South cooperation. Look at the BRICS countries. They are creating alternatives like the New Development Bank, which could be a model for smaller nations to explore.
And Karen, what about trade? How can smaller states avoid being overshadowed in global markets?
So they would need to focus on diversifying their economies and building regional supply chains. CARICOM, for instance, could invest more in intra-regional trade to reduce the reliance on external markets.
Great point, Karen. And on a global stage, issue-based conditions like AOSIS are key. They are slow that even the smallest nations can drive change when they unite around a common goal.
So it's about reforming the system while also finding creative ways to work within it. So small states may not have the same power as larger ones, but they're not without options. So, final thoughts. What should people take away from today's discussion?
So people should know that network governance does have its strengths, but it needs some serious reforms to truly benefit small states. Right now, the power imbalances still dominate.
Agreed. But small states are finding ways to fight back through alliances, coalitions, and creative diplomacy. The question is whether the system will evolve to meet their needs.
And that's why it's a complicated world after all. Thanks for joining us today, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'll see you next time.
Bye.